I have come to the view that our politics is completely broken and we're going to need some kind of new movement or vessel that is going to basically reassert the values and the values and the voice of ordinary people, that is going to be anchored in the principle of popular sovereignty, which is going to put, a bit like Brexit, the majority view against the elite minority. And on these issues like immigration, crime, embedding a principle of national preference into the economy, into housing, we see large majorities of people, 70, 80% are very supportive of all of those things. So I'm of the view that after 2024, we've got massive elections in Europe, the UK, the US. I think there has to now be a new generation of people who can actually come forward and say, look, this political consensus isn't working. The status quo isn't working. The political parties that were built in the time of the Industrial Revolution, they're no longer really working for a majority of people in the country. We're going to need something different. The question is, what is that thing? What does it look like? And who does it draw together? It needs to position itself as being above left and right, and it needs to speak very loudly for the forgotten majority. And if it does that, and it does it convincingly and in a credible way, it will be enormously successful, because I'm firmly of the view that the political zeitgeist that we currently have, big state, high tax, mass migration, low growth, pro-woke, is completely at odds with where the vast majority of people are. And we've seen that in places like Scotland. We've seen it in places like New Zealand, in Canada, in Australia. When a lot of these elite positions are put before the people, they are rejected en masse. So we need to create new political vehicles.
Why do we pander so much to the woke? Because it appears that they would lose any kind of election. They don't seem to make up any kind of majority. Why are they being pandered to?
I don't think that they're being pandered to. I think they have power. I think they have consolidated their power over the last 20, 30 years. I think, as we know from all of the surveys, the people that we would associate with the social justice left, the woke movement, whatever your preferred term, and I understand why people are dismissive of the word woke, but they are, undergraduate, postgraduate degree holders. They live in the big cities, the university towns. They come from privileged families. They've got a large degree of economic security. And they also disproportionately dominate the institutions. They tend to work in the universities, in the museums, in the galleries, in the BBC, in NPR, New York Times, etc., etc. And so they don't only wield power within the actual corridors of power, but they also wield an enormous amount of cultural power in the national conversation in terms of shaping the prevailing norms, rules, laws, values that they claim represent us. And actually, that conversation is not the conversation that the vast majority of people out there in the country want to have. But on multiple levels, they're wielding political, cultural, and economic power. So they are able to do many of the things that we've seen, in Scotland, where they push for children to be able to legally change their gender without any supervision, or in the UK, where the incoming likely Labour government is saying it's going to give away government contracts on the basis of race and ethnicity, or it's going to make it easier for children to change their gender, or in the US, where we've seen similar calls among Democrats and others to completely overhaul policing, which by all accounts has been a complete disaster in low-income, crime-ridden societies. And, I'm a pollster too, so whenever you put these positions out to the country, they're usually 15 to 20% positions, renaming pregnant women pregnant persons. I mean, that's like supported by 10% of people.
Yeah.
But as we saw in the UK with the CAS review of our National Health Service, what's happened is the elite expert class have gone so far in on things like gender ideology, where they're basically pushing kids down the medical transition pathway. They're not actually anchored in evidence anymore. And that's one of the most disturbing aspects of this for me, that when you look at the expert elite class and, they're all saying, well, why doesn't anybody trust the experts anymore? Well, if you look at things like the major government review, the CAS review, Dr. Hilary Cash, she looked at gender ideology in our healthcare services and basically said, look, a lot of the stuff that's happening here that's being promoted by the expert class just doesn't have anywhere near enough evidence to be happening. I mean, there's just insufficient evidence to be doing this stuff to kids. So I actually think, people have been justified in questioning the experts, because it isn't just about stuff like that review. It's these disastrous foreign wars in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq. It's endless inequality. It's a global financial crash, and not bothering to really punish anybody responsible for it. It's not regulating financial services. It's the constant elite failures for much of the last 20 years that I think have led people to look at all of these issues and think, well, hang on a minute. I'm not actually convinced the expert elite class does get things right. Maybe it is time for something different.
That's right. I find when people, they don't like us using the word woke. And I sort of agreed at first. Now I started thinking about it. I find that really insidious. It's this slippery kind of thing where we know they were using it about themselves. And they even still, many of them will say, oh, woke just means being aware of unconscious bias and this kind of thing. And then when we use the word, they go, oh, that's a bit simplistic and that's not the thing. And we know exactly what we mean when we use it. So
sure.
I think we should say it with
I think woke,
pride.
just briefly, woke is a useful catch-all term. But it's like, don't start the culture war, say the people who started the culture war.
Yeah.
I prefer the term radical progressivism because that's what it is. It's radical liberal progressivism, which has a history that goes back really to the early 1900s in New York and Greenwich Village and the Bohemians, and we can go into all of that if you want. But I think it's a very distinctive ideology with a distinctive history, which has not come from Marxism, by the way. It's certainly been influenced by Marxism, but it's come from within liberalism, and it's got traits of liberalism about it. The kind of obsession with minorities being virtuous, the disdain or the suspicion of the majority group. A lot of that comes from liberalism, not Marxism. And over the last 50 to 100 years has increasingly asserted itself onto the institutions and the cultural fabric. So, whether you call it woke, whether you call it social justice, identity politics, radical progressivism, we all know what it is. I think we have a good handle on what the identity politics part is about. I think moderate liberals and center-left folks are beginning to wake up to the problems inherent in this worldview. I've been influenced by many people on the left, Yascha Mounk, Susan Neiman, Carl Rhodes, David Brooks, David would describe himself as a moderate conservative, but people who, David Goodhart, people who I think have often come from a center-left position, what we might call a moderate center-left position, but who have said, well, hang on a minute, this radical progressivism isn't even liberal at all. I mean, what is this? And I think slowly, Tony Blair and Barack Obama and others have sort of been saying, yeah, hang on, this is it's getting too radical, and this isn't really helping the left's cause. Yeah. So it's important. We're not just talking about right-wing culture warriors. We're talking about a growing consensus within the center, right, center, left, and so on, classical liberals, that what we've let out the bag here is not liberal at all.
Yeah, I like that Obama thing. That's not woke. Woke, whatever. That's not cool. I don't know what he said. I don't remember what he said now, but it was good.
Good impression.
Yeah, it didn't come out how I thought. I thought for some reason, I must be able to do an impersonation of someone I've never tried to impersonate before, but it didn't happen. So one of the places we've seen this historically. I know you went back to Greenwich Village, you said, but Iran in what was it, the 1970s? Was it the leftists siding with the Islamists, and the Islamists got into power with their help and then killed them all. It's the frog and scorpion.
And historians, Tom Holland and others, would argue that what we're living through is something that goes back centuries and draws on many traditions and legacies within Christianity and so on. So yeah, I think we can all agree, and it's been a long time coming, but we are, this debate about have we reached peak woke, which is a fashionable debate among elites. My instinctive read on that, looking at the surveys of millennials and Gen Z, my instinctive read looking at what's happening in the institutions, is we've only just begun to see what's going to be happening in Western societies. I think this is just going to accelerate the embrace.
Woke's going to get worse.
Yeah, I think the embrace of woke capitalism. I think the embrace of identity politics. I think the rise of center-left parties that are much more radical on cultural issues than they used to be. And remember, one of the things that is driving this, which takes us into some of the arguments that are popular in the US, one of the things that's driving this is a reaction of radical progressives and liberals to the rise of people like Donald Trump, or the rise of things like Brexit or Marine Le Pen and so on. So as the populists do better, as they're drawing in working class voters and conservatives, non-graduates, and so on, as they do better and better at elections, I think liberals are going to radicalize even more. The kind of great awakening that scholars like Zach Goldberg and others have tracked. And I think that they're going to become even more committed to this worldview over the next 10, 20 years, because fundamentally, the elite liberal class want to disassociate themselves from the masses, because partly this is about status. They want to be seen as part of what Rob Henderson would call the luxury belief class. They want to project the beliefs that win you status and esteem among the high end of society, and they want to disassociate themselves from the Trump voting, Brexit voting masses. But I think they also genuinely feel threatened. I think they genuinely believe they're living in a revival of German Nazism. I think they think that we're on the end of days, and that Donald Trump is the new Adolf Hitler. And I think in response to that, they are radicalizing and becoming much more accepting of the radical cultural left. And you see that in a lot of the survey data. So this isn't just about people on the right expressing their anger and frustration at what's happening in the West. This is also about the fact that we are living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. I think we are living through the radicalization of the elite class, of the people who dominate the institutions, who've basically gone off a cliff on a lot of these issues around migration, identity, gender, history, and now basically define themselves by being anti-Western, radically progressive, pro-immigration, pro-Islam, anti-Israel. And for them, it's become now an overriding identity. And that's where I think we are.
Do we have to worry? I mean, we're humans as well. We have the same evolutionary biology. Do we have to worry about also reacting and moving too far the other way and maybe picking evidence that suits our purpose against the woke?
Yes, I think we do. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody is vulnerable to confirmation bias, to choosing the evidence that fits with our beliefs, motivated reasoning, interpreting that evidence in a way that's consistent with our beliefs, to tribalism. But again, this goes back to why free speech, free expression, and a diversity of viewpoints within the institutions is so important, because you cannot counter confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and tribalism unless you expose people to alternative viewpoints. So if the institutions are all dominated by the same kinds of people with the same kinds of values, with the same kinds of backgrounds and the same kinds of political loyalties, well, we're not going to be able to challenge the confirmation bias and the motivated reasoning and so on. So the institutions become a monoculture, and then everybody else ends up just breaking off. And that is, by the way, why we're seeing the rise of this alternative ecosystem on YouTube and, with the Substacks, with the new television channels, with, all of the new media, which I personally think is extremely positive and beneficial, so long as it remains within the parameters of, a democratic conversation. I mean, I personally have absolutely no interest in anything that would position itself against representative democracy.